I'm very bad with technology. And I think today's theme is fraud, because I am not a curator, even though I'm going to pretend to be one today. As Evelyn said, I sort of curate this series at the Dance Space Project in New York City. It's a monthly series of works in progress. But I want to talk a little bit about Judy's work, Judy Hussey-Taylor, who's the director of the Dance Space Project. Move this over just a teeny bit. I also want to thank people, but since I'll mispronounce all of your names, I'll just thank all of you together. But also especially Jalili for being such a great host in Lagos. It was really wonderful being there. It was my first time in Africa, and it was incredible. It was a mind-blowing experience. Because I was an English major in college and not a performance major, and I also, Stefan, I have no degree also, but I teach at university, so we have that in common as well. But I wanted to go to the sort of like the word source of curator. And it comes from Middle English. It denotes a ecclesiastical pastor. It's from the Old French curateur, and it has to do with a keeper, a manager, or overseer, or custodian of a cultural heritage institution. For example, a gallery, a museum, a library, or an archive. He or she is a content specialist responsible for the institution's collections and charged with the interpretation of heritage material. And it also curate comes from the same root as cure. The original noun sense was to care for, to concern, or responsibility. In particular, spiritual care, the Christian minister's pastoral charge or area of responsibility for Christian ministry, for spiritual ministry, sorry. So there's this spiritual dimension to the etymology of the word curate. However, in the United States, the term curator has now suddenly become conflated with the words programmer, presenter, or producer. And people, you sort of use them interchangeably, even though they mean very, very different things. A programmer is one who arranges, according to a plan or a schedule, a series of future events or performances, whereas a presenter is one who offers artists opportunities to show their work before the public. And a producer is a person responsible for the financial and managerial aspects of making a performance. Somehow I think the word curator, at least in the States, is being used because it has a more highfalutin, classier sound than presenter or programmer. What I do at Draftwork is definitely as a programmer, since the Dance Space Project happens in an active Episcopal church. I have to make sure that there are no weddings scheduled on the days that I'm planning a program. So most of these small and medium-sized venues in New York with which I interface exist in a situation somewhere between being a presenter and a producer. The executive directors of these spaces are not able to offer full producership to a creation of a work. They do search for funds, for commissioning funds, but it's usually not enough to cover all the costs of making the work. Dance Space was founded 40 years ago in 1974, and it was among a constellation of other artist-founded not-for-profit organizations that in New York included The Kitchen, which is in an old ice house, a former ice house, Dance Theater Workshop, which was in a tire factory, Performance Space 122, which was in a former public school, Dixon Place was in the curator's living room, and La Mama was on a sound stage. So you sort of get the idea that these spaces were spaces that were found and repurposed. And across the United States, there are other spaces specifically for dance. The Dance Place in Washington, D.C., Diverse Works in Houston, Texas, Red Cat in Los Angeles, and there are scores of others. And most of these places have a single executive director who makes most, or if not all, of the curatorial decisions. I'm going to make a sidebar. I actually made a nice graph, but it's not showing, of where money, I was asked where funding in the United States comes from and where it goes. For a small to mid-sized organization such as DanceSpace, we have a budget of about $1 million, which is considered small in the United States. The revenue comes from, 50% of the revenue comes from private foundations, 25% comes from individuals, and that's the segment that is growing most. 15% from earned income, which could be ticket sales, sales of t-shirts, space rental for rehearsals or other performances, catalog sales. 10% from government, which means local, state, and federal government, and that has been steadily declining. And 0% from corporations. That was already declining in the early 2000s, and after the economic downfall, almost all corporate sponsorship for not-for-profits disappeared. When I was in Nigeria, when I was in Lagos, doing a workshop, most of the Nigerians were surprised, I think, Jaylee, that on the staff of DanceSpace, there's an executive director, there's a technical staff, there's one person for finance and one person to run the office and one person to do the marketing and PR and 4 people to do fundraising. It's sort of totally out of balance, but it takes it's that intensive an activity to actually bring money into a not-for-profit theater in the United States. There are problems for bringing work into the United States from abroad. In New York City particularly, there is no way of cheaply housing people. Hotel prices are through the roof. Visas are another incredible problem. Before 9/11, 2001, it was hard. Now it's near impossible. Someone's quoted the statistic that out of every one foreign performer you see on stage, there are 20 that have been rejected. There are some geographic specific funding sources. The Fund for Mutual Understanding brings in work from Eastern Europe. The Asian Cultural Council brings in work from Asia, and the MAP Fund from Africa. But these are like sporadic and very particular. So bringing work in to the United States is problematic, and without the help from the sending country, it would be impossible in most cases. So the title of this talk is Building Platforms, Alternative Modes of Curation and Presentation. And Judy and I have been in discussion about this symposium. And I want to talk to you a little bit about her, since she is sort of the spearhead of this idea of platforms in performance curation. Before she came to DanceSpace Project, she worked at the Boulder Museum of Contemporary Art, and she was the deputy director of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver. Both of these are in the state of Colorado. And then she became the director of the Colorado Dance Festival. The combination of these 2 jobs in both the visual arts and the performing arts gave her a lot of insight in how curation is done in the visual art world and what is lacking in the curation of performing arts, particularly dance. Before she became director of DanceSpace Project, when she was at the Colorado Dance Festival, she became close friends with the choreographer Ralph Lemon. And when she came to New York, he told her not to limit herself. It's to do what she does. He told her not to limit yourself by what curation was, but to be adventurous about the possibilities of what dance curation could become. She was also inspired by the Nigerian curator Okwe Nwizor, who was the first non-European curator for Documenta in 2002, Documenta 11. And this was a sort of controversial Documenta. I'm assuming they all are controversial in some way, because he developed what he called platforms, where before, so in the 18 months before the event in Kassel, he took groups of writers, filmmakers, artists, anthropologists, social scientists, and took them around the world for these platforms to places like Vienna, Delhi, the island of St. Lucia, and Lagos. And the criticism was that his document was destabilizing the form that had already been established. And that criticism was both positive and negative. And Judy became uninterested in the model of contemporary dance presentation that had been happening in New York and in the States. And that model is basically a choreographer would work on a project for a year and a half, and then perform it for maybe 1 weekend, maybe 2 weekends, if they were lucky, 3 weekends, and then it would disappear. In January, there's what is called the January Shit Show on Ice, also known as Arts Presenters Week, in which we sort of tart ourselves up like prostitutes and parade ourselves in front of presenters and trying to get hired by festivals worldwide. It's not a pretty sight, but it's what we do. But Judy felt that there was a better way of presenting art. So she was using Weizor's idea of platforms, in which she wondered what would happen if she gave 4 artists her budget and 4 weeks of her presenting time to do whatever they wanted. And her mandate was say yes until it has to be no. And she gave them a quote from Okwui and Weizor, which said, "The role of the curator is not to be a tastemaker, but rather to create knowledge of the artist and the world in which he or she makes their art." And this world includes things like their studio practice, the socio-economic world in which they make their work, the structure of their work, and other issues affecting their work, and to actually bring that knowledge to an audience, not just the performance of the work. The one common thread that sort of goes through all of these platforms, and she's been doing them since 2010, is that she thought it was really important to have a printed catalog of the work because of the ephemeral nature of dance, that it happens and then it disappears, that there needed to be some record other than a review in the New York Times, a record of people thinking and analyzing what was the work, what was the thing of the work. So all of these platforms had their own different shape, their own different trajectory, but they all have their own different catalogs. I'm going to pass these out. I have to get them back because they're mine, but I'm going to pass some of them out. So the first curator was the choreographer Ralph Lemon, and he did a platform called I Get Lost. Juliette Mapp did a platform called Back to New York, which featured people who had left New York and came back. Trajal Harrell, the choreographer, did a platform called Certain Difficulties, Certain Joy. And Melinda Ring did one called Retro Introspective, which featured the work of Susan Redhorst and people who she was influenced by and people who were influenced by her. So after these 4 platforms were successful. They gave people a different way of looking at work, a way of paying attention, a way of bringing attention to the work, a way of the artist paying attention to their audience. And she felt that the platform idea that actually caused that sort of two-way communication and attention giving, both from the audience and to the audience. So we continued with the idea. The next was called Body Madness, which dealt with artists who used the materiality of the human body as the source material of their work. Thank you. And Judson Now, which dealt with Judson Dance Theater in the 1960s and how that has still affected dance, especially postmodern dance that's being made now, in both a good way and a not so good way. Diary of an Image was a platform that dealt with the work of a single choreographer, Didi Dorvelier, who used to live in New York and now lives in France. It's a very pretty catalog. And it came in 3 different colors, I'm not sure why. And the most recent platform was called Dancers, Buildings, and People in the Street. The dance critic Claudia LaRocca paired sort of young star dancers from the New York City Ballet with downtown choreographers and put them together for about 3 or 4 months just to see what would happen. And some of the things that happened were very, very interesting. Some of the things that happened were very, very not interesting. But it was an experiment. It worked. It didn't work. It happened. So now I want to, in 2012, I was the artist curator for a platform. It was called Parallels. And it was 2 months of curated program interrogating the connection between Black choreographers and postmodernism. Here is a view of St. Mark's Church. It's one of the oldest continuously operating churches in New York City. It was the home church of Peter Stuyvesant, who was the Dutch governor of New Amsterdam before it became New York. And it's been in continuous use since the 1700s. And it's very beautiful. It almost burned down in the 70s, and when they reconstructed it, they took out the benches. And so there's a beautiful 30-foot by 40-foot dance floor. And it's sort of a very spiritual and uplifting and very flexible place to present art. So in 1982, I curated a series, a 2-week series of what I called Black American choreographers who were working beyond the mainstream of both Black dance and modern dance. And here I am in 1982, quite handsome, I think. And the others are Radha Christine Jones, the late Harry Shepard, Fred Holland, Ralph Lemon, and myself on the fire escape of the church. Poster from that series in 1982. The most remarkable thing, I think, is that the entry is $4, which is about $20 to get into a show there now. It's a piece that I did at Parallels. It was called Part 2 Relatives, in which I plucked my mother out of the audience, carried her around on my shoulder and put her in the space and allowed her to improvise a text while I improvised a dance around her. Probably the scariest thing I've ever done in my life. The series got a fair amount of attention. And then in 1987, a group of us from there went to Paris, London, and Geneva in what was called the Parallels in Black tour. On that tour, Bibi Miller and Ralph Lemon created a piece called Two. It was the first time they'd worked together. And so in 2012, I decided to revisit these ideas of mine, and to see what had changed both in my concept of what Black dance was, this is the age of Obama. Does being Black mean the same thing in 2012 that it does and that it did in 1982? In 1982, I was unaware of any contemporary dance coming out of Africa. I didn't know there was contemporary dance in Africa. I had a very naive view of what Black dance was. The new series included a wider variety of people. I won't name them all. So the first week of the series, I decided to give over curation because I didn't want it to be my voice only. I didn't want to be the voice coming up from above. So I chose 3 choreographers of my generation, Bibi Miller, Joelle Will, Joe Zallar, and Dean Moss, to shape a night of a weekend of their own, of whatever they wanted to do. Joelle did her evening was called Black Jam, which investigated the many ways in which improvisation has always been a part of the Black dance vernacular, from the Savoy Ballroom in Harlem to Africanist dancing to break dancing, that there's always been an element of improvisation in the Black dance vernacular. Baby, on the other hand, did something called Where Are You Calling From?, in which she used only female choreographers and female choreographers of different generations. This is a piece by Cynthia Oliver. So it looked at roots and heritage and lineage of Black female dancers. The third night of the weekend was curated by Dean Moss, who was a dance curator at The Kitchen in New York. And I want to read his statements, I kept this catalog. He called his evening Black Dance, and he says, I'm interested in Black, in quotation marks, identity as it pertains to otherness and its association with the outsider. Pedro Jimenez, Youngjin Lee, and Anne Liv Young are amazing artists with sincere and slippery relationships to identity. Each of them creates work that brilliantly pushes the boundaries of what is and is not performance, what is and is not self. None of them are African American, but all of them are Black. So in his evening, Youngjin Lee, who is a Korean American theater maker, submitted a video of her being slapped repeatedly, which I won't show you. Pedro Jimenez did a piece that I was totally mystified by. I'm not sure what it was doing, but it was Dean's night, and Anne Liv Young, who is a very provocative choreographer and performance artist who often performs under the guise of a persona called Sherry, came to this festival in blackface, and she's a white performer, and started an argument. Actually, a fight broke out in the audience. People stormed out, demanded their money back, and Judy and I were talking about who was responsible. Was Judy responsible because she's the director of the space? Was I responsible because I was the overall curator of the platform? Or was Dean responsible as the curator of that particular evening? Or was the artist responsible, or was no one responsible? So it brought up these very kind of tricky questions about identity, responsibility, which have not been answered, actually. And last year, Anne Liv also got thrown out of another festival, so she's a character. The next weekend, I chose three mature artists, Reggie Wilson, two artists, Reggie Wilson and Dean Moss, who curated the evening the previous week. Reggie did a piece with Solomon Badolo, who is from Burkina Faso. They started out with just having a conversation on stage, and then Solo began doing a very intense solo dance. It was called Solo for Solo. The following week, I curated an evening called From the Streets, From the Clubs, and From the Houses. I wanted to investigate work that came from Black instigated social dancing, club dancing, voguing, break dancing, because in the 1982 iteration, I had not considered that as legitimate concert dance forms. And all of these people actually took those forms and took them in a more concert arena. This is three shots from Dean, from Daryl Jones's piece, in which he works with Ralph Lemon and Bibi Miller. He's a very accomplished postmodern dancer, but he chose to work with two Vogue dancers. And the piece is actually a very postmodern piece. It's a very engaging piece. It won a Bessie Award that year. as I said earlier, and in 1982, I was totally unaware of any contemporary dance coming out of Africa or any immigrant families, any choreographer from an immigrant family living in New York. So I chose these two women, Okwe Okwesali and Nora Chukwamira, who's from Zimbabwe. Okwe is from the Bronx, but both her parents are from Nigeria. And I just wanted to sort of place them together to see how their works would talk to each other. Nora did a piece called Black Heifer, in which she danced only on a very small platform, which was sort of like a pedestal, sort of like an auction block. The audience was seated on four sides around her. Okwe, on the other hand, did a more theatrical piece in which she read notes of 11-year-old girls, one of which may have been her, coming into sexual awareness. There was moving, there was singing, there was reading of these supposed notes. The following week, I decided to focus on younger, lesser-known choreographers, Samantha Spies, Marjani Forte, and Kyle Abraham. Kyle recently won the Meek Arthur Award, the Genius Award, but he hadn't won it then. Just sort of to see what a younger generation of African-American dance makers would make. It's a shot of Marjani's piece, Samantha's, and Kyle. Kyle sort of uses more of a classical vocabulary mixed with sort of street dancing as well. On the next to last evening, there was this sort of mishmash of events happening. Dr. Thomas DeFrance, who is the head of Black Studies at Duke University in North Carolina, did a performance lecture. He sort of tap danced while he gave the lecture of the history of Black dance. Henry and Barbara Pillsbury, who brought the Parallels in Black tour to Paris, to the American Center in Paris in 1987, talked with myself and Blondell Cummings, who were artists on that tour. Trekking is a piece by Stacy Spence, and it's a durational piece. It lasts about 3 hours, in which he treks around a performance area while other activities are happening. And Will Rawls did a screening of video performance work that happens mainly on the internet and YouTube. So I have a couple of shots of that. There's Stacy trekking outside the church. There's Stacy trekking inside the church. And there's the panel discussion about the Parallels in Black tour with Stacy trekking behind us. And that is Judy Hussey Taylor is on the far right, who is the director of Dance Space. And the final evening of the series, the final day actually, was an all-day series curated by the choreographer Ralph Lemon in conjunction with the sculptor Nari Ward. Nari set up an environment of objects in the church. Ralph chose 12 African-American choreographers who each have 1 hour, so the piece went from 11 a.m. to 11 p.m., in which we were invited to do a piece that was about visibility and invisibility, and to work with the sculptors any way we wanted. There was a 10-minute overlap between pieces, so one would work for 50 minutes and then the next person would come on, and there would be a slight moment of interaction, and so I just have a couple of shots of that. Ralph with one of Nari's sculptures, which is usually composed of urban detritus. And there's Okwe Okwesali, who we saw earlier. And it's sort of interchanged with Okwe and David Thompson, who did this piece sort of was about gender and S&M and other stuff. And solo, there's another choreographer, I forgot who that was. And this is the only time I performed in the platform was I was the last performer on the last evening of The End. And this is a shot of me. I decided it was a conceptual piece that I never rehearsed, and I probably should have, in which I sealed myself inside a garbage bag with a flashlight, a microphone, and a book, and I was going to read, and my object was to get from one end of the church to the altar within an hour. I didn't realize how hot it would get inside a plastic bag. So I was sweating so much that I couldn't read the book, so I began singing Madonna songs. This is me in the crossover between the person before me. It's me about halfway through with another one of Nari's sculptures. There's me at the altar, just about at the end of my hour, and there's me collapsed on the stage of the altar, still alive, but just barely. I'm doing another platform in the fall of 2016, which I've just begun working on, which is going to interrogate the effect, and it's very sort of difficult because I'm trying to prove a negative or try to illustrate a negative, the effect that the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s and 90s had on queer performance art today. So I'm trying to figure out what the deaths, that there were so many deaths in the dance community during the 80s and 90s, and there's a whole generation of artists who are making work now who didn't live through the trauma of that, and I'm going to try to figure out what that trauma, what that lack of trauma is. So I've begun working on that, but it hasn't happened yet. Thank you.